Thank you, Carla. This theme is very relevant to those of us who follow economics, especially Austrian economics. There's a good discussion within the Austrian school, even within the mainstream, whether all these injections, monetary injections sponsored by central banks will cause inflation in the future, or if we can have a scenario like Japan in the 90s, where despite several quantitative easing events, there was no inflation. That is the theme for the debate within the Austrian school. I think the majority view is that there will be inflation. There can be the Japan scenario is a minority view. But the debate is interesting because both Japan in the 80s and the United States today and the European central banks work on the monetarist hypothesis that what causes recessions is the reduction in the money supply, so they try to avoid this by printing money to keep a constant amount of money in the economy. But that ends up injecting money into the banks, and the banks can create this currency based on their own decisions. And oftentimes, because they're in a fragile financial state, they don't forward this money and loan it. And this money of the central bank doesn't always actually develop into credit in the marketplace. We see this today. The banks have all the money, and they have not begun to lend the money. One theory is that when they start to lend this money, this will cause massive inflation, hyperinflation, some people say. And another line of thought thinks that this money might stay in the banks. The system might keep deleveraging on one side. The central banks continue to try to inject money into the banks, and these things cancel each other out, and you don't have inflation. So with this background, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Mueller. He's helping us found the Mises Institute in Brazil. Very dear person. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. The great topic of the Austrian School of Economics shows that it's not only limited to economics, it also has financial market relations. Myself have found again the Austrian school as I was working in the financial market. And I was dissatisfied with other models, neoclassical models at that, Keynesian models that do not help us a lot, according to my practical experience at least, because in theory I always felt like an Austrian that I belonged to this tradition, and I almost rediscovered the power of the Austrian school towards analysis, and that lead us to results that are not 100% accurate, but on the contrary, the scholars of the Austrian economics say we cannot make prognosis, as opposed to mainstream economists that define themselves as a science that are able to forecast based on positivist ideas. But oftentimes when you see the outcomes of such forecast and prognosis, then the Austrians have a better record when compared to other groups of economists. And now, as we start talking about inflation and deflation, then my task here today, as an introduction to this topic, introduced to this debate is to contextualize, provide some background to it. It's very important to keep in mind the definition of inflation and, as a consequence, deflation. We have to have in mind a praxeological sense, in the sense that Mrs. gave it in terms of time and action. Now, the origin of the word inflation and deflation comes from politics. And in addition to that, in the widespread use and textbooks from the economics, they're usually the wrong meaning, give the wrong meaning to it. Because when you give the wrong meaning to inflation, some people say inflation, but they just mean that the prices are going up. They raise a contradiction, because originally inflation meant the real actual inflation of monetary mass. And when we accurately talk about inflation, you have to talk about how monetary mass increases, and as a consequence of this, there is inflation in the sense of price levels that go up. And it's always the concept of inflation as we use it today is also problematic when we talk about price levels too, because the great issue we have at hand is what products are part of the supermarket shelf, of our basic staples. We don't only have inflation rates that are different across regions because the basic staples, the kind of consumption is different. And so, of course, the meaning you give to inflation is different across regions because you have specific ways of consumption that do include or do not include certain goods. Now imagine if you own a home or if you rent a home, whether or not you're a vegetarian, whether or not you're a senior citizen and you need medication, whether or not you have kids, and you need goods special for kids. So if you take all of those into account, this becomes a highly problematic definition, not to mention the Newtonian index by calculating the differences in quality, for example. What connection do we bear in mind if you have a car? I'm not talking about computers, but let's keep the example of a car in mind. When you compare this with cars 20 years ago, for example. So you would have constructions, not clear definitions, especially the way we measured inflation. It would open all windows and doors to all kinds of manipulations as part of basic staples. So what kind of statistics should you apply to it? So there is a huge uncertainty of what you're talking about. There's this mass confusion in terms of the application of the word inflation. Are you referring to the expansion of monetary mass? Prices, and in addition to that, there's this confusion about what are you really talking about. As Keynesian concepts got into economics, then the world of words that did not really exist. I mean, price level does not exist. It's a construct. GDP in this sense does not exist. It's a construct. Actual GDP that is relevant for us. I mean, when you want to calculate real, actual GDP, you need price index, don't you? Now, for all our calculations, that we estimate, saying that the economy is growing and so on. In theory, well, they do this in practice now. You can, based on manipulations, you can lower or increase it based on variations according to inflation rates or price indexes, which you also need to measure productivity. So before we get into the key figures, you have to bear all of that in mind. This is the price index with all of the reserves that we have. Starting in 1918, by the end of the First World War, the Fed started operating in 1914. And so here's our first period with certain inflation level over the 20s. Then this long period of stabilization. And then you can't call this deflation. It's almost a little bit of, just a little below the price level. There's an uptake here over the 50s and 60s, and after that the takeoff, which is very important in the 70s. And ever since, we are part of a new trajectory that goes on to this day. There was a recent recession with a small change, and again we're following the same trajectory. And when we talk about inflation, so far we have gotten this right in terms of the definitions that we use for inflation. We are having strong inflation when compared to our past, even in the common sense. Now what does that generate? That's not just generation, not just inflation. This is the monetary base. The smallest aggregate is this currency that creates the federal bank. And this monetary base, you notice that it's well controlled over time, but there is this basic element of this inverted pyramid. And on top of that, you might increase the monetary base, and you have this takeoff over the 1970s. And what one can say is that there is a relation here, for sure. There is some form of relation between the monetary base and the inflation rate that has been measured. And what's most impressive is that recently it's the financial crisis and its impacts. There's a boom. There is a thesis that there is a relationship, and in theory, both theoretically and empirically and historically. Now the key question is, why do we have this huge boom of monetary mass, and why isn't it manifest more strongly, more evidently, more clearly, more dramatically in the price levels, which is also wrongly measured in a more gross manner?